All right. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Puget Systems Podcast. This month, we're talking about hardware trends for 2024, and we might even get into our hardware reliability article that just literally, like within 5 minutes, just hit the news wire. I'm joined by Eric. Hold on. Sometimes it's reversed. I'm joined by Eric Abernethy and Matt Bach. As always, I like to give everybody an opportunity to introduce themselves, tell us who you are and what you do. And so, Eric, we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Eric. I'm with sales. One of the newest members to Puget. Yeah, pretty straightforward.
And Matt.
So I'm Matt. I'm like head of our labs team, which does most of our like hardware testing and articles and stuff. But I also tend to write these kind of like hardware trends and hardware reliability ones. Not for any reason except that I've written them in the past, and so I just keep doing them because I like and I know how my reports work. So that's why I'm on here. But I'm excited to have Eric on this because I think we've done live streams about this topic in the past, but it's going to be really interesting to hear Eric's take on from the sales side because I see the data, I don't always see the why. So it'd be really interesting to hear your take on it and see if you ever disagree with any of the the things I pulled out.
Sure. Yeah. I think it definitely will give a different perspective to it, especially with the customer's feedback on the articles that you've created, and the just raw data doesn't always translate to customers' needs and also just how they feel about a product.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And for those of you who are watching, you can follow along at home. I pasted a link in the chat for you guys so you can follow along on the article as well. And yeah, so I guess since we've got introductions done, let's go ahead and just get started into it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you mind sharing my screen here? Yeah. We can just go into it because the interesting part's the data, not us talking or our faces.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of launches last year. So I kind of want to tee this up. Like we had, technically it was in 2023, but at the very end we had like Core 14th Gen. We had the new Threadrippers, which were interesting because we had both Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, whereas before that it was just Pro.
Yeah.
I think, or it was just Threadripper.
Yeah. No, they brought back the Threadripper.
Yeah. So we had all that stuff. We had like the new RTX Pro cards, the Ada generation stuff. We had the 40 Super Series. Ryzen 9000 launched towards the end of the year. We had some Xeon stuff, and at the very tail end of the year, we had the Core Ultra, and then the Ryzen X3D for the 9800, which we don't sell, but that sometimes influences what people are looking at. And then same thing on like the Arc B580. That was very end of the year. Again, doesn't really affect us as much because we pretty much just sell NVIDIA, but we always like look at them and see whether it's good for us or not. So tons of stuff happening last year. I mean, that's a lot, especially the fact that like there's basically 2 CPU launches from like Intel within basically a year. It's nuts. And the one thing I always like to clarify, we always have to put these big disclaimers on here. A couple of things that's always worth clarifying. One, this is just our sales, and we're like high-end content creation, engineering, scientific stuff. So like our numbers aren't going to line up with like DIYers or gamers. Like gamers love like AMD GPUs, but for us in like content creation and stuff, NVIDIA is just dominant. So like it's just different use cases. So yeah, keep that in mind. This is also just all of our workstation stuff, our desktop stuff, not our server stuff, not our laptop stuff. It's just, I don't know. Those are very specific and not as interesting, I think, to the general reader. And then last little disclaimer here is that all of our numbers are per order, not per system. We sometimes will get like a large quantity order for some single user, and it's like they're usually doing something pretty niche, and like they could sell, or we could sell like 100 Xeon CPUs, and that like almost matches AMD for like that week. But like it makes the charts and graphs all weird and spiky. And a lot harder to like actually pull useful information out of. So this is all per order, not per system.
Okay,
cool. That's all the caveats. Okay, let's get into some interesting stuff. So CPUs, I have this split up by client or consumer client and workstation, but first just all. And it's really interesting to look at because we finally are selling more AMD CPUs overall than Intel for the first time since really early 2022. So basically 3 years, Intel has had a slight lead in our systems, like a 60-40 split. And now we're in Q4 of 2024, we had split. It was like kind of a slow trajectory, and then we split. And I'm going to skip straight down before I even ask for Eric's thoughts down to the separating out by client and workstation, because I think that's where you really get into the interesting. Because in the client space, so Intel Core, AMD Ryzen, we are still more Intel Core than AMD Ryzen. But it is, I mean, look at those lines. They are quickly heading right towards each other. And I attributed this to Ryzen 9000 is just really good. It's a great CPU platform. And two, Intel Core Ultra was kind of lackluster. Like it's lower power, that kind of stuff, but like performance hasn't really shifted. And I wonder how much their branding change affected just like recognition. Not having Core i9, now it's just Core Ultra 9. And then three, there was a lot of messiness throughout 2024 with Intel 13th and 14th gen stability issues and all of this stuff. And we've got whole blogs on that. But so that like, I think that just gave a little bit of fear for some people that, you know, even businesses that usually buy Intel, they're like, maybe we'll try AMD. But Eric, I'm interested in your thoughts here.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think there's I don't think it's a coincidence that you see Q2 of 2024 is when the charts really start combining. I believe that was right in time for the Raptor Lake beginning, of whatever was going on with the microcode. And I think by the time that was addressed thoroughly by Intel with the BIOS releases, I think Ryzen had already started like, hey, 9000, look how stable it is. It's still consistent. And so you really dealt with, I guess maybe not necessarily a fear, but let's say an uneasiness about people, spending a lot of money on a workstation that represents their primary source of income and going with, a processor in it that isn't necessarily getting great press right now. And they're like, oh, well, what's the downside to it? Well, Ryzen will still take care of this, except for a very few particular workflows that need that quick sync from Intel or whatever it is. And so if it's a coin flip system, which a lot of these are, where it's just preference, absolutely, it started the dominoes started falling Ryzen's way just for stability, and it's not really going to affect them negatively.
Yeah, and I know we even changed some of our recommended systems because, like you said, a lot of these are coin flips. Like if you go to our articles for like Ryzen launch and Intel launches, a lot of them are like, yeah, it's within 5%. Cool. Which way should you go? It's whichever one you want. And we defaulted a lot of stuff to Intel, especially in the content creation space, because even if you're like a graphic designer, they still tend to do some video work because people's job roles are getting crazy and way too overarching. So it was like, well, if they're basically the same, then you might as well go Intel in case you want to use quick sync like you were talking about. But now it's like, well, am I really going to do that? No, probably not. Okay, then I'll go with the AMD side. And we even reflected that on our hardware recommendations.
There's also some update too, like to Windows, I think, that gave a pretty significant boost to Ryzen CPUs, right? Right around that same time, or at least during the whole Raptor Lake stuff.
I'm not sure. There's been so many updates and stuff, and for Intel too. Like I think we have another overhaul or another article coming up soon about like the latest microcode stuff and how that changed things. And so it's just it was just a kind of a mess all year.
Yeah, I agree, and it's really hard to have conversations with the content creators or even the purchasers where they're curious about, hey, what's this release going to do for this system? And sometimes, actually, a vast majority of the time, it's going to be easier to say, hey, why don't we just aim down this path? Or even if you are really concerned about uptime, let's just look at more of a Threadripper system, something that we don't, they're like, oh yeah, hey, that's too powerful, or let's go this path. And really the conversation then is about, well, let's go with a Ryzen. Oh, I don't like Ryzen. Okay, let's look at the Intel. Well, Intel had microcode. Well, let's just go with the Threadripper. And so a lot of times it's just picking, a path that makes sense for them, and it's a coin flip. It really is. and trying to wade through the BIOS release, updates and all the new releases for each manufacturer gets a little tedious with some of these customers.
Yeah,
It was the transition.
The branch prediction update that I was talking about. And it didn't seem to be too significant. Like, I think the biggest change was just shy of 5% in Cinebench. So yeah, it didn't make too much of a big splash. So
not for us.
I thought that was more significant.
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of that kind of stuff tends to have more of an impact on like gaming than the stuff we're doing. But talk about Threadripper, we can jump down to the workstation CPU stuff. So Workstation we classify as Threadripper, Threadripper Pro, and Xeon W. There's also like Xeon SP, the dual socket stuff. We don't really do much of that. A little bit in the server space, but not really on workstations anymore. We used to. We used to even have like a quad CPU workstation, but those days are gone. There's no point to it anymore. So this chart's a little bit funky because like there were times I think like back here there was only Threadripper, there wasn't Threadripper Pro, and then there was kind of both. Or like we transitioned and then there was only Threadripper Pro and now we have both. So there's like a lot of weird transition-y kind of stuff here where like I think we were carrying Threadripper even though it was previous gen for a while because Threadripper Pro was so expensive.
Yep.
So you can also kind of just think about this. If you just want to compare AMD to Intel in this space, you can just look at what Intel is and just know that AMD is the opposite of that because there's only two. But basically, AMD has long been about 80 to 90% of our workstation sales, all the way back to 2021 and even a decent amount behind that. So AMD is just dominant in this space. And that's why even though the client stuff, Intel is still higher, our total CPU sales, AMD has overtaken in large part because of their workstation stuff. So right now, throughout the whole year, we were pretty... I mean, again, because Intel versus AMD has been so similar, it's basically just been AMD's 90% of this, and between Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, basically the same. I think I calculated it out, and across the entire year, it was a 2% difference over total. So, like, that's way closer than I expected. Like, I thought we'd have a little bit more between Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, but nope, it's almost exactly a 50-50 split.
Wow. It's kind of a shame that Intel hasn't really looked at the HEDT stuff. I mean, what it was like X299 was the last real platform that had sort of a bridge between consumer and then these higher end, like Xeon always to me calls up server stuff. Like it's not something you'd normally put into a tower, but when you had that X299 platform, they kind of have offered you a bit more of kind of best of both worlds. And I feel like that's part of why AMD's been crushing it in this space.
Technically, Xeon does have two classes, just like Threadripper and Threadripper Pro. They have Xeon 2000 and Xeon 3000. And just like Threadripper and Threadripper Pro, the difference is like core counts, PCIe lanes, RAM capacity. So it's actually a pretty similar split. It's just the boards, I think, are a little bit more expensive. And just like we just see such low sales in that space. It's usually for very targeted stuff, people who need specialty AVX stuff for like AI or scientific computing, that kind of stuff that like we just kind of lump it together. But we totally could have split out Xeon 2000 from Xeon 3000. I think actually, Eric, do we even sell Xeon 2000 or do we just decide like, nah, it's not worth it?
I think we have the ability to, but I believe 3000 is the primary lion's share of our Xeon sales. And you summarize it. It's really hard to target Xeon customers just because they'll get in touch with us and they'll be like, I need a machine for a very specific scientific computational process, and I need a Xeon. Why do you need a Xeon? Well, we've only ever run Xeons for this, and so that's what we're going to continue. Cool, perfect. If it's going to still work for you, it's still going to work for you. But I think there's a reason why you see Threadripper on the majority of the workstation workflows and the viability of it.
Yeah, and eventually I did want to dig into this a little bit more. I'd love to see, and I have these reports, I can do this, but like separated it out by like actual CPU. I'd be very curious if like Threadripper, we do a lot of 24 and 32 core, and then Threadripper Pro, we do a lot more 64 and 96. I think a lot of Threadripper Pro, though, please correct me, Eric, is like it's more about the platform capability than getting like the 96 core. I don't think we sell too many of the 96 cores. It's about all those PCIe lanes, all that memory, and that kind of stuff, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it depends on the amount of expansion cards they're going to place into the system, or if they need just huge quantities of RAM. And that could be, very specific workflows like a landscaping company that uses like a terabyte and a half of RAM just when they're opening their program. Well, then you need a Threadripper Pro. And so it's pretty specific workflows that really benefit from that. Or if you just like to have the overhead, I guess, ceiling growth room that the Threadripper Pro would offer, if you have an unestablished workflow, like you're starting a startup, or you're starting to incorporate other workflows from different departments and you don't know what that's going to entail, a Threadripper Pro is a safer option.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just surprising to me how close to 50-50 those are. Okay, so we can move down to GPUs. Honestly, I think some of this stuff after CPUs gets a little bit less interesting because things haven't really changed a ton, or it's kind of changed as expected. But GPUs, some caveats here that I was kind of talking about before. We pretty much only sell NVIDIA. We have a smattering of AMD or Intel kind of stuff, but like really nothing to even worth throwing on a chart. But what we can do is chart out the GeForce versus the RTX Pro cards, because I think that's kind of interesting because like a lot of people don't quite understand the difference between these product lines. Like they'll look at benchmarks and they'll see that like, oh, GeForce like a 4090 is as fast or faster than a 6000 ADA, even though a 6000 ADA is like 4 times the cost. Why the heck would I ever do that? That's stupid. But they don't understand that like it's not just performance. The Pro cards are actually clocked lower in order to get higher reliability. The drivers go through way more qualification processes than even the studio drivers for GeForce. They do have higher VRAM capabilities. They don't have, or they have way better double precision performance. They have ECC memory. They've got all this other stuff that like, it's not about performance on those cards. It's about reliability and compatibility. If you want 4 GPUs, you're not getting that with GeForce.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even some things too, like the sync, I can't recall the proper term for it, but for like when in those virtual production workflows where all of these little monitors all have to work together and that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head too. It's the difference in the capabilities, and the people that need that ProViz. They definitely know it, and that would be CAD users and other ones where it's only certified for their programs, point cloud generation, and then you brought up the high VRAM capabilities of like the 6000 ADA, which are used in like the LED walls for the nodes. So there's definitely workflows that benefit from it, but if you look at reliability, the GeForce cards are already reliable, but I don't know if I've encountered a failure of a ProViz card, and that's that downclocking. Definitely, we'll say more like a lower clock speed of them, maybe not downclocking, but that generates just such high reliability.
Yeah, and because we actually do, if we have time, we'll poke into it. We do have a reliability article as well, and it's actually really interesting to look at the failure stats because GeForce is great, but they tend to have a little bit higher field failure rate than Quadro, or sorry, not Quadro anymore, the RTX Pro. The RTX Pros actually have very similar failure rates, except they fail as DOA, which like for us and our customers it's annoying, but it's fine that it has a similar failure rate as long as they happen for us and not after we've shipped the system.
Yeah. Better that we absorb that for sure.
Yeah. But like actual numbers, like if you go way back, we did have an increase from like 10% to 20% through like 2021. That was, midst of COVID. I think we were like virtual production, like we've been talking about, was kind of taking off. AI stuff was starting to really take off around then. But it's been pretty much flat ever since. We're doing more and more systems for AI and virtual production and all that kind of jazz. But we're also just doing more systems for other stuff. So I think it just kind of balances. And I think there's some people that are still trying to make it work with GeForce. Like there's people that are doing virtual production, but like it's not an LED wall, it's like green screen stuff, and they're using Unreal Engine, but like they're not doing multiple nodes, so they're trying to make it work with GeForce because they're just some little studio in somewhere. So not everyone is going with those RTX Pro cards, but definitely the big LED walls are.
I'd be curious too to know the spread, because like I know we tend not to carry the like lower end cards, at least in terms of GeForce, and I'd be curious to know like how many of these are the 4090s, the 3090s, that kind of thing, spread across these years. Versus,
we have those numbers.
I think we go down to about the 4070, I think 4070 Super.
Yeah, somewhere around there. Yeah, and I can tell you those numbers. I don't know if we're ready to share those numbers publicly, but it's always
more my own curiosity.
Yeah, it's always a hard thing with these kind of articles because like we want to be transparent and we love sharing numbers, but you'll notice like all of these numbers are always in percentages. They're not in unit counts because we do still have to protect ourselves on the business side, between, sharing what's useful and interesting and that people can find value out of without providing too much ammunition to our competitors, basically. Where then they can just like super easily copy us, and then we're just playing that game. So it's always a tough balancing act to find. Okay.
Operating system.
Moving on to OS. Okay. So for years, this section has mostly been about Windows 10 versus Windows 11 because Windows 11 launched at the end of 2021. So you can see it right when this green line started, being not zero. Whoop. But there was a lot of software compatibility issues for like 6 months. Like we're talking like Adobe apps wouldn't launch and run, and like it was a mess. Around Q2 2022 is when we said, all right, it's looking good. We can start pivoting our workstations. And I think we basically were like 50-50 on like defaults. But just over time, people more and more were choosing Windows 11. Finally, like halfway through 2022, or no, that's almost to Q4. They finally split 50-50. And it's just been slowly growing, and it's kind of trailed off for about the last year. Now, a lot of this was because we couldn't actually do Windows 10 directly. We had to do Windows 11 and then do downgrades. So it was kind of a pain, but we would still do it because there were still people who really wanted Windows 10 for insert your reason here. But the reason why I bring that up is because we can finally not talk about this next year because we just discontinued allowing Windows 10 on our workstations, which honestly might really have, maybe we should have done it quite a while ago because like end of life is coming up in like a year.
It's October?
Yeah, is it this October?
It's October.
Yep.
Like that's nuts. There are still people like I need Windows 10 for like what was it? It was 2021. So 3 years people were wanting to use a previous gen OS. That's nuts.
Yeah.
Do you still get people asking Eric in sales, or is that finally gone?
So Windows 10 has been sort of a tricky one. I think on the sales team, we emphatically believed that a lot of the support should have ended. But we do acknowledge that there are customers that have legacy infrastructures in place, and they have to have a Windows 10 just to drop it in and have it just plug and play with what they have. We still do, but now with the new Core Ultra line and Wi-Fi 7, Wi-Fi 7 is not compatible with Windows 10 in any way, shape, or form. And so that means that, for the customers who are like, hey, we want Windows 10 with this new Core Ultra, well, then there's more conversations that had to happen about this won't work. You're going to need to put a dongle on your $6,000 or $8,000 computer to connect to Wi-Fi, which isn't, a fun conversation because we want it to be, a perfect system. Does take it out of the box, and their out-of-box experience is amazing. But definitely, it's going to be the specific workflows or people with custom written software that they just don't want to upgrade, go through and redo it to be compatible with Windows 11. And that was a gentleman that I helped a couple of weeks ago. Is he only coded his software to work on Windows 10. And so that sort of situation exists. And I believe there are still some abilities, that we can reach out and have conversations in the building to accommodate their needs. But there's certainly very few and far between after we just say, no, we don't carry this by default. And they're like, okay, let's do Windows 11.
Yeah. They're like, okay, fine. We'll make IT finally deal with like how their software is so outdated.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and to be honest, like I'm still amazed when like it's engineering spaces like manufacturing where like you still every once in a while see someone like share a picture and just like learning Windows XP and you're supposed to like transfer the CAD stuff on a floppy drive. It's like, oh my, because those are like multi-million-dollar machines. Like you don't touch them. Still,
right. That's exactly what it is. It's worked for them since 2015 or 16 when their company in some instances came to be, and they don't want to reassess it or redesign the entire wheel that's worked for them so far.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to see the slow creep up in Linux too. Like there's a little bump over 10% like in Q4 23 and Q2 24, but it looks like it's slowly on the come up there.
And Linux is a little bit interesting. So this article is all about workstations, but out of curiosity, I did toggle it over to like our server stuff, and server is almost exactly the opposite. Our server stuff is like 90% Linux, 10% Windows, which totally makes sense. But it'll be a little bit interesting to see if it goes up anymore. I don't know how much it will, just because of our focus in workstations is on like content creation, engineering, and a lot of that stuff. Like Adobe doesn't work on Linux, so like anyone doing content creation, even if they are like primarily a DaVinci Resolve person, unless the machine is only for that and that period, they really need to be able to open like Premiere Pro projects, because who knows what a client's going to send them or have as an existing stuff. So they still need to be able to like have like Adobe stuff. There are some areas where like very specialty stuff like Autodesk Flame or engineering stuff, some of that stuff for like especially like simulation, server or Linux. But then a lot of that stuff will go server. So
right.
I
think
changes.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's not going to be necessarily what our focus is or what's going to work for us. It's going to be a reflection of the application creators. Like, what is Adobe going to support? I mean, I know from what I've heard, a lot of the video editing workflows benefit from Linux because it's a lighter weight operating system. I've heard there's more features in some of the applications. Obviously, I don't edit with DaVinci or any of those programs full time, so I can't verify that. But there's some interest. But I think it's gonna take Adobe saying, hey, let's jump into Linux support full time, and then I think we would see this absolutely go and maybe even closer to like a 70-30 or a 50-50 split.
Yeah, because Linux is interesting because I can mostly speak for media and entertainment areas, but like the people who want that kind of stuff for like DaVinci, it's because it's a computer that's going to be offline. It's not going on the internet because like it's like LucasArts kind of stuff, like Star Wars kind of things where like that system's never going on the internet. It's coming like the footage is coming in an armored truck. They offload it. And like there's armed guards and stuff, and like those people, they just like they need it to work and not change. In Windows, you have the problem sometimes of like it really wants to do a Windows update, and like drivers sometimes do weird things. Linux, like you can lock it down. But there was also some issues. When was it when CentOS got weird? Because like DaVinci Resolve, CentOS was their OS of choice, and then CentOS basically died because of like weird licensing stuff. And now it's like Red Hat and these other ones. And like, it's a little bit of a mess, I feel like right now. We'll see how that changes.
That. Yeah.
Okay. And then we had a couple of new kind of stuff. I think we touched on storage the last year when we did this article, but new this year, because storage is hard because you have like multiple drives. We've got NVMe, we've got SATA SSDs, we've got Platter. Capacity, like total capacity, is just all over the place. Like I was trying to do some reports and it's just like all over the place because like one guy could be a video editor and he's like, oh yeah, it's terabytes fine because I have a NAS. Another guy will be a video editor and he'd be like, I need 20 terabytes of local storage because he doesn't. So how we did it this year, one, we took out the NVMe versus SATA SSD versus Platter because almost every drive we sell these days is NVMe, at least as far as like OS drives, platter, or that kind of stuff. Once you get into like storage drives, we do still do some SATA SSDs, a handful of platter drives and that kind of stuff. That's mostly like into our big servery kind of stuff though. So we dropped that chart and we decided to focus purely on primary storage.
Okay.
Because again, like we tend to do multi-drive setups and primary is the only one that tends to be consistent. We're like,
Sure.
this is a drive for people's like OS, their applications, and like temporary like downloads and documents and that kind of stuff. So all that said, I charted this a couple of different ways. One is just our average capacity on our primary drives and how that's changed since 2021, which the story is basically nothing really changed in 2024. Our average capacity was just over 2 terabytes, but that is an increase from 2021 of 1 terabyte. So it has gone up, but that's not like a massive increase year over year. It's like 20% or something like that. But we are at the point now where people are kind of deciding that 1 terabyte, maybe that's not enough on average.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can contribute some there from the sales side. I feel there's a lot of customers when they go through and configure their own systems, they just go through and click that up from 1 to 2, just based on the fact that they're used to, you know, getting a little bit bigger on their OS drive. They're also going to see the increase in size of programs and applications that is constantly just it's never ending. It's a conversation I have like all the time with customers about, hey, all these programs are getting bigger, the updates are coming, let's try and get you some more space. You know, when we go and do a background check with them, like, hey, how much of your current drive do you have? And a lot of times they'll say, oh, I have 268 megabytes free on my 500 gig SSD. And we're like, well, let's have a conversation about upgrading that. And the price point is so aggressive now to go from 1 terabyte to 2 terabyte. It's in the grand scheme of a Puget system, it's so small. So it just gives a little, it's very minor. I think it's almost an afterthought. Just if they're on the fence about it, just do it.
Yeah, that's nothing. Like, and I was actually surprised you were telling me we were kind of prepping for this that SATA SSDs are actually more expensive now.
Yeah, that's shocking to hear that too. I'm a little surprised.
At least at 1 and 2 terabyte. Once you're up to like the 8 terabyte NVMe's, then yeah, and that's why people still go with the SATA SSDs if they need large local storage.
That was a conversation I just had today with a customer where he had an 8 terabyte NVMe as his secondary. And he was looking at other options, and I said, well, you can go with a 4 terabyte NVMe and an 8 terabyte SATA, like 2.5 inch for basically the same price. So at the larger capacity NVMe's, you definitely pay that premium for the speed over the SATAs. But yeah, I think that's the whole reason you see the 2 terabyte taking over. Oh, well, average. It's just the price point.
Before we move on, less of a question, but more of a comment from Twitch, and I'm going to kind of direct this more toward Eric. Mr. Tiago Tavares says, which is interesting since a lot of the work is being done in the cloud. And I'm curious, Eric, how much that does come up on your side of things. Like, how much work is being done in the cloud where maybe the workstation doesn't need as much local storage?
Sure. It's a great question. So the way I summarize this is each of our content creators and our customers' workflows are so unique. It's like a fingerprint. I think that's one of the things that gives R&D and labs, fits is you can't just summarize anything. There's so many tests that need to be done, so many, benchmarks that need to be, explored. And whether or not they have a NAS or a DAS, or they have long-term storage, or they have externals they're backing up to, and they're just throwing in a file cabinet and never looking at it again. But I would say that cloud might actually be going down as far as the amount of users that I work with. Just because once they've worked these files, like for, video content creator, maybe they're doing 3 to 5 minute clips, they'll go through, they'll work it. Now they might want to keep like an extra copy of it on a platter drive somewhere, but it doesn't really make sense for the price point when they're storing 20 or we'll say 15 or 20 terabytes in the cloud forever. That's definitely going to add up. And so I think that's why we're seeing, a 1 terabyte, a 2 terabyte, and then a 20 terabyte 3.5-inch platter in their systems isn't an uncommon configuration. Just because I think the price point of storing that much data in the cloud just isn't feasible for a lot of, especially, smaller overhead shops.
Yeah, and I think that extends to compute as well. I forget who says this or if it's an internal thing or what, but it's basically you want compute being done where your data is. And like a video editor, like you said, they might do a shoot and now they've got 20 terabytes of footage. Man, just uploading that into the cloud is going to take a decent amount of time and it's expensive. And actually, if you actually want to work off of that data in the cloud, that's even more expensive because actually it costs money not just to store it, but also whenever you have to pull the data out. And a lot of these workflows for like video editing, the cloud is like terrible for it. Like the performance in the cloud is junk.
Don't tell Adobe.
Yeah. Well, it depends on what you're doing. Like if you're using like Premiere or DaVinci Resolve, it's terrible. Something like Rush, I think they do some stuff and like you can offload. And I think Adobe is actually doing a great job of figuring out when to offload. Like Photoshop is a great example. Like their generative fill stuff is all done in the cloud.
Sure.
Great. And it works great. I'd love it if they had a local option because I think there's a lot you could do there. But they do some of that stuff in the cloud. They do some of it local, just wherever it makes sense. And the stuff that's going to the cloud is the stuff where you're not actually having to pass that much data to the cloud. You're passing a little bit of data. It's doing all this hard compute and then giving you a little bit of data back. That's like the ideal for the cloud. But most of the things that we are focusing on, there's big local data and it's just hard to do it into the cloud unless you're like a giant Hollywood where you have to collaborate between people in multiple different countries all across the globe, and you have to have super strict file permissions where like they never actually have this data. They just have access to it that you can turn off. And that kind of like file security stuff. That's where like these kind of workflows in the cloud do exist, but they're pretty niche.
Yeah.
We'll scroll down. So averages don't always work the way you think. That's my conclusion of this. Because we're talking about 2 terabytes, the most, or the average, but 1 terabyte is still our most common single space drive capacity. 2 terabyte has been increasing as price has gone down. And it's probably going to hit parity, like maybe even this quarter. I wouldn't be surprised. 500 gig was very popular for a while. We finally dropped that before 2024, so that's gone. But 4 terabyte has been increasing pretty quickly, and even 8 terabyte. We're seeing not much because usually those drives are like secondary drives. I'm a little bit surprised they're here as primary at all. But
yeah, that's some. Because I mean that's like what 5 to 8% or so,
somewhere
and
around there.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, 1 out of 20 systems that we sell has an 8 terabyte drive as the primary.
Wow.
Yeah, that was actually my morning, is having a conversation with the customer about his 8 terabyte primary hopes. And I think some of it has to do with, sometimes they come in with the angle of, I just want to get a they call it the overkill system, or, they just want to swing for the fences. But again, sometimes there are going to be those specialized applications that they absolutely need to have a huge amount of space in their primary for cache or for whatever it is, how their program actually functions. And that would probably be, so I would guess my gut on those would say it's either going to be the overkill customers or it's going to be the ones with very specialized workflows where they only can use a single drive. Like sometimes the scientific community, they can only, their stuff's only optimized for a single drive in their workflows.
It'd be interesting if we'll have a 16 terabyte on here next year. I don't think so, but
I would imagine we will. I know that that's something R&D is working on right now, is cool. 16 and 30, 15.72, I think.
It's like
30.
a $12,000 drive. That's crazy.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Nuts. Okay. And then I think this is the last section. Let me double check.
Yes.
Yeah. RAM. So this is completely new this year. We never have done RAM stuff in the past. And this came out of like, oh, hey, if we're doing primary drive capacity, why don't we do that for RAM? So same kind of deal here. I'm surprised at how consistent the growth has been all the way back to 2021. Back then, 80 gigs was the average in our systems. Now we're up to, it's like 150 or something for like all of 2024 was like 150 gigs. So especially considering this is throwing out server where like 512, a terabyte, is kind of common. It's kind of amazing actually that it's gone that far up over, just a handful of years.
Yeah, it's my hunch on this, obviously I wasn't with the company back in 2022 or 2023. The average capacity that you can throw into a sort of a core or a Ryzen system being 192 gigabytes right now. And a lot of times that's how the configurations come to us, just straight up is 192 gigs of RAM. We want the max we can throw in the system. And that's probably going to skew it some as just based off of that. From start to finish of the system being configured, they started 192. Do they need that? Probably not. I mean, even some of the heaviest workflows I've seen in like After Effects with 6K raw, they're still only seeing 110 to 130 gigs of RAM being used when they, when they're working the project. And that's one of the most RAM heavy applications I've experienced. So do they need that much RAM? I don't know, but I think the price of RAM it's an aggressive price point now, and it's inconsequential to a lot of individuals when you configure, you take that into account. Like, how much is it out of a $6,000 or $8,000 or $12,000 system just to cap it on RAM?
Yeah, I mean that's not a big difference going from 128 to 192, less than $200.
That's it.
And a lot of those workflows that you talk about, like heavy RAM, like a lot of those, if you run out of RAM, it derails you completely. So it's just like video card memory. Like if you run out of VRAM and you're doing stuff, well, shoot, like then you have to start thinking about, all right, how can I optimize this? How can I split this up? And it's going to take you a whole lot longer to do that project. And $200, like if you're counting your time as like $50 an hour, like I think for a lot of these people buying these kind of systems, like that's being very modest. That's like 4 hours. Is the life over the life of this system? Is it going to save you 4 hours to not have to deal with those problems? Probably. Probably.
Yeah. That's absolutely a conversation we have. Time is money, and that's part of the I guess the discovery process when we're helping these customers is, when they're explaining their workflow, and they're like, oh, hey, I have 3 monitors, and they list off 12 or 15 applications they're using. It's common to ask them, how many of these programs are open at the same time? And sometimes they'll say all of them. And then we just want to take that RAM slider all the way up just to try and make sure, and sometimes it's not even viable. Sometimes we tell them it's not going to work on a Core or a Ryzen system. We need to look at a higher RAM capacity, machine. But I think with drives and with RAM, the aggressive price points makes it almost an afterthought just to slide that bar a little bit further along than you expected when you were coming in, just so you don't run into that ceiling. That's got to be so frustrating to get a tailored workstation, but you didn't want to, spend another $40 or $80 on RAM or $200 on RAM. And now you're talking to, it's not as optimal of a experience as we would like for you.
Well, and even what you're saying about like, well, how many of those applications do you have open at the same time? I've had plenty of conversations at like trade shows and stuff where you talk to people like, oh yeah, I've got to close Photoshop and then open After Effects, do some stuff, close After Effects and then open Premiere and then close Premiere and open Photoshop. It's like, you don't have to do that anymore. Like that's right. Your system is like 10 years old. You could just have them all open now. And like, you could just do stuff. And like that 30 seconds of waiting for those different applications to launch dozens of times a day, oh man, their workflow just like explodes. And I know I've heard that as feedback on like people who just bought like a system of ours, or even like people DIY building their own. They're like, it's amazing. I don't have to close anything. And like, it just changes their entire workflow.
Yeah, that's such an important stage with the conversations we have when we're helping a customer is, what does your workflow look like? And sometimes they could say, I have only ever opened Photoshop. And, sounds like you're going to get, a Ryzen chip and probably a 4060 Ti because you're working with tiny pictures. But when they explain, like you were saying, with where that customer or whoever you're talking to at the trade show listed off every Adobe Creative Suite program, that's probably going to save them hours and hours over the course of a year to just have a couple of those programs open at the same time rather than going through and selectively opening and closing them one at a time.
Okay, so this is the worst chart. So RAM got kind of awful if you're looking at total capacities. One, there was already quite a few different sizes we were doing before like 2024. It was like 32, 64, 128, 256 were like the primary ones. And then we had a few 512s, but it's basically 4. Problem is now we have new stick sizes. That was because we had 8, 16, 32 gig sticks, that kind of stuff. Now we also have 24 and 48 gig sticks. So it's like the number of combinations is so much bigger. So that's why we have this new like 96 gig capacity is something that didn't really exist before. 192, 384. Like there's these weird capacities now that like took me a long time to not think that was someone mixing like RAM sizes.
Yeah, it's so weird.
It across my brain. So that means that these charts have gotten worse, and you can see where they all started in beginning of the year, or Q1, Q2, somewhere around there is when we started carrying these 24 and 48 gig sticks. And it did some really interesting things. So 128 has been our most common total capacity for quite a while. It took a nosedive in 2024. 64 gigs has been kind of going down. I think just over time it's being, cannibalized by 128s and these larger 256 and all these other stuff. But it's just been steadily going down. And I think that's pretty much just 64 gigs doing what it's been doing for a while. It's not enough for a lot of people. And then 128 took a big nosedive because it's being cannibalized by either 96 or 192. It's either people saying 128 gigs is probably a little bit too much. Let's save a little bit of money. Let's drop down to 96. Or, man, 128 is not quite enough, but I really don't want to have to jump up to Threadripper so that I can get 256. Like, it's a big price jump, not just in the RAM, but in like the CPU and the platform.
The motherboard, the CPU. Yeah. Oh, man.
So now they can get 192. And those have been skyrocketing. I'm really interested to see 2025. But 96 and 192 are both at about 10%. So 1 out of 10 systems, or combined 1 out of 5. I think those are just going to keep skyrocketing. We're still going to see some growth in 256, some growth in 512 and that kind of stuff. But it's mostly going to be those 2 new ones with the 48 gig sticks that are just going to go sky high.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's not a pretty chart by any scope of the imagination. And I think that, you'll see the 128 gig, definitely the decline, it corresponds immediately with the 192 and the 96. Yeah. Because I think for the longest time, Ryzen systems had a 128 gig max. Mm-hmm. And so now with 192, you'll see the 96 gig just start flying up. And then if they want to go, like I said, the ones that come in and they're spec to the max, and that's that 192. And I mean, that would be my guess as to why those directly correlate with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, because a 20% drop here and then 10% increases here.
Right. Right.
Yeah. I am going to be interested to see. So there's a couple of blips on here of 384 and 768. I'm going to be interested to see if those do much of anything. Those were very few and far between on the workstation side. For sales, I think it's actually a little bit higher than what it shows here if you were actually looking at per system instead of per order, because some of our quantity orders tend to be like crazy because we're doing very crazy things. So like I know we've sold a decent number of like these kind of things. It doesn't show up in here because of how we're sorting the data, but hopefully we'll have more. And 1 terabyte on workstation stuff, I think we've done a handful of those. It just wasn't enough to statistically like show up in this.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, I mean, just even the total of 768 is uncommon when you can figure. You look at what size the DIMMs are. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that pans out coming out like the next year.
That's got to be like Threadripper Pro, and they're. I mean, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you need it, you need it. And, oh boy.
It's crazy. Yeah. And to be able to do that without having to jump to some sort of like crazy dual Xeon monster is pretty remarkable where we've come. Because I remember putting together, I think it was one of the Quad Xeon machines that I put together had 2 terabytes of memory, but we had to like special order these DIMMs, and it was like 8. I think it was like, what would it have been, 8 256 DIMMs or something like that. It was insane.
They needed like specialized cooling.
Yeah,
they were like this thick. Yeah,
I remember bonkers. Yeah, those, what a crazy. And now it's like, oh, we're not that far off from doing that in just, well, what we would consider a normal system. Like, wow, that is even possible without it being super special. It's pretty cool.
Yep. So that was all of our trends. If there are other things that people are interested in, I mean, toss us an email. I think like, I actually don't know who. Maybe put on social media in Tech Houston or
Sure.
the Puget Systems account.
Yeah.
Because like there are a few other things I was considering looking at, like chassis size, like looking at ITX versus micro ATX versus ATX. That didn't quite work out for some reason. I don't remember quite why.
Well, we dropped ITX for a while, so
yeah,
I guess you'd plug in NUC as the comparison, and then, but maybe, yeah, we can say we're bringing ITX back. We're bringing ITX back, so maybe next year's we'll look at that.
Yeah, but like that kind of stuff, I was maybe thinking about for next year. The problem is like anything really beyond that, and it starts to get into like business. We have to like really strongly consider: is this something we're willing to share? Like if it gets into like what region buys from us, well, that's a little too specific.
I wouldn't mind industry, like how we have, you know, your media and entertainment, Kelly's like 3D and game development, and I think it'd be interesting to see how that spread out. I don't know if maybe that'd be too much secret business stuff, but I think.
We might. Again, like you said, that might get a little bit too into like, you know, what exactly are we selling to customers, you know, for our competitors. But the reports I have technically do have a tag filter. So it actually would be fairly simple for us to do that. We just have to decide whether that's
we'll kick that up the chain and see. We'll see what the bosses have to say. We have one. We got a good question here. Since we only have a few minutes, I don't want to get into the reliability stuff, but it would just be to touch the conclusion and wrap things. But we've got a question here from YouTube from LF 2021. What are you guys thinking about the 5090s? What video cards do you guys think are good currently?
I think wait for reviews. That's pretty much always my answer. But pre-launch, you just gotta wait. I mean, I think everyone like NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD, they're all getting better about like not being super misleading on their launches, but they still are cherry picking because I mean, of course they are. So wait until I believe availability for the 5080 and 5090 is like available end of January or something like that. So we should have stuff around then. You know, sometimes we don't have stuff right on embargo date. Sometimes we have to wait. But we should have, we plan to have articles for the entire 50 series whenever we can, as soon as we can.
As soon as we get them. Yeah, as soon as we get them. When we're able to talk about it.
Yeah, and we're able to talk about it. So keep an eye out. We'll look at them. I mean, any GPU launch is always very exciting for us. There's often lots of changes. It feels like GPUs are leaping ahead in like performance and capability faster than CPUs. CPUs have become kind of ho-hum every launch. GPUs are still really interesting. There's also some things that they've mentioned that I think some people have missed about like 422 decoding is like a point on the new GeForce line. It's going to be really interesting to see like what that actually means, what software works on it, and all that kind of jazz. So there's some other stuff beyond just raw performance that's going to be interesting this time around.
Yeah, and if I could touch on that too, the second part of that question, as far as what video cards do we think are good, it's whatever one fits your workflow. I think the launch of any new card definitely creates this sort of hold pattern. But if you're dealing with a system that's hamstrung by, you know, like you can't churn through your workflow because you're on a system from like 2020 or 2018 or 2014, I think it definitely makes sense to absolutely look at just upgrading to a card that we already know works, like a 4090 or a 4080. Whether or not you're going to need a 5090, we don't know what they're going to do. Probably 40% of the correspondence I have now with customers daily is about the 5000 series launch. And they are still absolutely moving systems with 4000 series cards because customers need a better system to help them right now.
Yeah.
So,
I always like to say, like, you can always wait. There's always going to be something new every 6 months. You can always wait for the next big thing. Buy the best that you can afford right now. Buy the best that makes sense for your need in the moment. Because
we even have people who don't want the latest because
Sure.
there's often launch bugs, there's driver weird things. You don't know what availability is going to be like. Like, there's plenty of hardware launches in the past where it's launched, but you can't buy it for months.
Yeah.
So it's like the people who are waiting because it's like, wow, it's going to be available in 2 weeks. Well, it's not really. No. Whether this launch is going to be like that, who knows? No one ever knows until after launch. But yeah, so waiting doesn't always help you. It just depends on what you're doing, how far behind are you. Like, if you're working on like AI stuff on your local system, like AI development, yeah, maybe wait for the 50 because there might be new features and stuff. But if you're like a video editor who already like the return on investment after like a mid-range card is like diminishing, probably not going to be a big deal to be on a 40 series instead of a 50.
Yeah.
One more from YouTube by Ethelbert Coyote. How has availability on Threadrippers been? They're great, but historically, it's hard to get chips. Your options shrink on what else is popular at AMD.
I have seen no supply issues with Threadrippers. My time at the company, I haven't seen anything. The 24 to 64 cores are the ones that I'm most familiar with, and I haven't seen one where we had to wait more than maybe a day to get it in stock.
Yeah, I mean, we're different than general public. Like, if you're just trying to buy one on Newegg or Amazon, our distribution channels are very different. We get allocation and we have forecasting and all that kind of stuff. So it is different than for us than if you're buying your own system or building your own system. But one thing I'll clarify here is on our website, if you're configuring a system and if it does not have an extra like shortage or ETA something, that means that we can basically we either have stock or we know that we can get it immediately. We're very good about updating our configuration pages to say if there's a delay or a shortage or an ETA. And I'm not aware of any parts right now on our website that are like delayed ETA kind of stuff.
No, the last part I'm familiar with was the 9950X, and that shortage was handled very quickly. There are some doom and gloom forecasts about the Core 9, and those, our supply chain quickly fulfilled those. We didn't end up waiting anywhere near the amount of time we thought we were going to.
Yeah. They follow up to say, I know Lenovo had a deal that hurt launch numbers on the last series is all. And they had a deal with AMD where they were like first to market essentially. But I don't know that really held us back much in terms of supply.
Technically a little bit. It just put some of our people into holding patterns because that was after review embargo. So we knew exactly what the performance was. And it was just like, for like a month, only Lenovo was allowed to sell Threadripper. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I really don't like AMD playing that kind of game. And we've given them that feedback. But I'll leave it there. But I don't remember if they did that on this latest series. I don't think I'm aware of. I think that was just on the 5000. But again, because the review embargo was before even they were allowed to sell, we were at least able to tell our customers like, hey, you should hold, or there's no point to holding. And the people who were going to hold just held for that month. And there you go.
Oh, well, okay. One last question before we leave from YouTube. PB asks, how do ARM processors compare to x86 processors, finite element codes such as Open Radio SS?
Finite element, I have no idea.
I'm not sure.
I've been looking at ARM.
But...
Yeah, I mean, it's statistical or like it's like simulation kind of stuff for like engineering mostly, and I'm sure other stuff too. But I've mostly been looking at ARM for content creation because I mean that's my focus. I do a lot of our benchmark development. We had to make sure we have ARM support and Snapdragon and all that. And in that kind of stuff, they're still quite a ways behind. There's some cool stuff that they're doing, but I think at CES we saw a lot of like ARM killer stuff from like AMD and Intel as far as like battery life and efficiency goes. So I don't really quite know what's going to happen with ARM. I really like having more options. I think there's also been some talk about like pairing ARM with NVIDIA GPUs or something like that. I haven't really looked into that too much. Where like, hey, if you don't need CPU power, why are you using Intel and AMD? Use ARM, it's very efficient, and then just throw a GPU on it. Like that sounds kind of cool to me. But for like FAE kind of stuff, I have no idea. I haven't heard of anyone doing much with that. I'm sure someone is, but man, Intel and AMD are so entrenched in that, and NVIDIA, that that's going to be a big lift for ARM.
All right. That brings us just a touch over our hour. Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. If you like this sort of thing, we do this the second Tuesday now of every month. So you can mark your calendars for that, 12 p.m. Pacific. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Matt, for joining me, taking time out of the day. This was good. We ran it right to the limit, and love it when that happens. So, and as always, I appreciate the audience joining us today as well. And I think that's it, and that's all. So we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.